The morning they took my company from me, my keycard didn't work at the front door of the building I had built. I stood in the cold at the glass entrance of Meridian Coatings, the company I had started in a rented garage 19 years earlier, and I swiped the card that had opened that door 10,000 times, and the little light stayed red. And through the glass I could see Dennis from security, a man I had hired myself, a man whose daughter's college I had quietly helped pay for, standing just inside with his hands folded in front of him and a look on his face like he wanted to be anywhere else on earth, and he would not meet my eyes and he would not open the door. And then my brother-in-law Grant Foley appeared behind him in a suit that cost more than Dennis made in a month. And Grant looked at me through the glass with an expression of practiced, sorrowful concern, the expression of a man who has rehearsed his regret, and he mouthed two words through the glass that I have thought about every single day since. He mouthed, "I'm sorry." He was not sorry. Stay with me, because what my brother-in-law did not understand that morning, what the board did not understand, what even my own sister did not understand when she later told me I had brought this on myself, was that the man they had just locked out of his own company was the only person alive who could make the one thing that company existed to sell, and that somewhere in a document Grant had forged with my own name, he had signed the beginning of his own destruction. It just took me a while to prove it. I am going to tell you how I proved it, and I am going to tell you how a quiet man takes back everything from a loud one, so stay with me to the end, because the end is worth it. My name is Marcus Reed. I am a chemist, which is to say I am a person who spent his whole life more comfortable with molecules than with people, and that comfort, that preference, is both the reason I built something remarkable and the reason a smoother man was able to take it from me. I want to tell you the whole of it, from the garage to the glass door and past it, because I think there are a great many of us out there, the builders, the technical ones, the people who make the actual thing while someone else does the talking, and I think we are, all of us, more vulnerable than we know to the Grant Foleys of the world. And I think you deserve to know not just how one of us got robbed, but how one of us got it all back. So let me start at the beginning, in the garage, before there was anything worth stealing. I invented a coating. I know that sounds small the way I say it, a coating, but I need you to understand what it was, because it is the whole engine of this story. For most of a decade, working nights and weekends while I held down a job at a paint company that bored me half to death, I chased a problem that the entire industry had decided was unsolvable. A protective coating that could survive both extreme heat and extreme saltwater corrosion at the same time, the two enemies that destroy metal in the places metal matters most, on ships, on aircraft, on the machines that hold human lives inside them at 30,000 feet and 30 fathoms down. Everyone in the field knew that solving heat cost you corrosion resistance, and solving corrosion cost you heat tolerance, and you simply could not have both. And one night in that garage at 2 in the morning, after 9 years of failure, I had both. I will not bore you with the chemistry, but I will tell you that when I ran the test that confirmed it alone at 2 in the morning, I sat down on the cold garage floor and I wept, because I knew, the way you know a true thing in your bones, that I had just made something that did not exist anywhere else in the world, and that it would outlast me. I filed the patent under a holding company I named Reed IP Holdings, because even then, even broke and unknown, some careful instinct in me said keep the crown separate from the kingdom. Remember that instinct. It saved my life. I want to give you one more thing from those early years, because it matters to everything that came later, and it is the thing Grant never had and never understood. In the second year of the company, when we were still tiny, still fragile, a competitor with real money tried to poach my first few employees, the handful of people who'd taken a chance on an unknown chemist and his impossible coating. They offered better salaries than I could match, and not one of them left. I asked one of them, an old technician named Walt who'd been my first hire, why he'd turned down more money to stay with a company that might not exist in a year, and Walt shrugged and said, "Because you're in the lab with us at midnight, Marcus. You don't ask anybody to do anything you're not already doing. That's worth more than their raise." I did not fully understand at the time what he'd handed me. I thought loyalty was a nice bonus. I did not yet understand that loyalty, the real kind earned in the trenches at midnight, is not a bonus at all. It is the actual foundation, the thing that no competitor can poach and no smooth man can forge, and that a company built on it can survive almost anything. Grant, years later, would build his position on charm, on managed belief, on the fondness of people who would leave him the instant it stopped paying. I had built mine, without knowing it, on the other thing, on Walt turning down a raise because I was in the lab at midnight, on Priya standing beside me through 10,000 failed batches, on the kind of loyalty that is earned and cannot be counterfeited. When everything collapsed, Grant's foundation of charm blew away in a week. Mine, the loyalty I'd built at midnight without ever tracking it as an asset, held. It is the quietest lesson in this whole story and maybe the most important. The things you build when no one is watching and nothing is at stake are the exact things that decide whether you survive the day everything is. That coating became Meridian Coatings. And Meridian became, over 19 years, something extraordinary. Because my coating was not a small improvement, it was a category of one. Aerospace and marine and defense clients came to us, and only to us because only we could make the thing, and we grew from a garage to a real plant to a campus, from just me to over 400 employees, and our flagship product, the coating I'd bled for on that garage floor, ended up on aircraft you have flown in and ships that guard coastlines and machines whose failure would end lives. I was proud of it in a way I have never been proud of anything except my marriage and, later, the thing I am building now. But here is the truth about me that matters to this story. I was a brilliant chemist and a mediocre businessman, and I knew it, and I did not care to get better at the part one was bad at, because the lab was where I wanted to live. And that gap, that honest gap in me, was the door through which Grant Foley walked. I met Grant 15 years ago, when Meridian was growing faster than I could manage, and I knew I needed someone to run the business side so I could stay in the lab where I belonged. Grant was everything I was not. He was smooth, he was charming, he wore his confidence like a well-cut coat. He could walk into a room of investors or clients and own it in 90 seconds. He remembered everyone's children's names and everyone's weaknesses. And he made me feel, in those early days, like the luckiest founder alive to have found a partner who could do the thing I couldn't. I brought him on as chief operating officer, and I gave him equity, real equity, because I believed, the way I believed in my chemistry, that you reward the people who build the thing with you. And Grant was good. I want to be honest about that, because the story is not that I hired an obvious villain and was a fool not to see it. Grant was genuinely good at the business for years, and the company thrived under the division of labor between us. Me in the lab making the impossible, Grant in the boardroom turning it into money. For a long time it worked. For a long time I thought I had found not just a partner but a friend. And then Grant married my sister. Her name is Laura, and she is 2 years younger than me, and for most of our lives she was the person who understood me best, the one who translated me to the world, the extrovert who loved her awkward chemist brother and never once made him feel like less for being awkward. When Grant started dating Laura, I was happy. God help me, I was happy. My best friend and business partner and my beloved sister, joining my family, binding us all together. I toasted them at their wedding. I said, in front of everyone, that I could not have hand-picked a better man for my sister or a better brother for myself. I meant every word. I have never in my life been more completely wrong about anything, and I said it into a microphone, and everyone applauded. That is the thing about a Grant Foley. He does not just deceive you. He gets you to publicly vouch for the deception so that later, when the truth comes, you have your own recorded words standing in the way of anyone believing you. Because I understand now what I could not see then. Grant did not fall in love with my sister and happen to be my partner. Grant chose my sister, courted my sister, married my sister, as a move on a board I didn't know we were playing on. Marrying Laura did two things for Grant, and he calculated both. It bound him to the company by blood as well as equity, making him nearly impossible to remove without tearing the family apart. And it gave him, over years, a channel straight into the heart of my family, a way to shape how my parents saw me, how my sister saw me, so that when the day came that he needed the family to believe I was the problem and he was the victim, the ground had already been prepared season by season, dinner by dinner, for years. I did not know I was being surrounded. That is the genius of the smooth ones. You don't feel the walls going up, because they build them out of warmth. The maneuvering, when I look back on it now with the clarity that ruin gives you, started small and slow the way it always does. Grant began, gently, to manage my relationship with our own board and investors. He would suggest that I didn't need to attend certain meetings, that they were just business housekeeping, that my time was better spent in the lab, and he was right that I preferred the lab, so I let him, and every meeting I skipped was a meeting where Grant was the only version of Meridian's leadership those people saw. He began to reframe me, subtly, to the board, always affectionately, always as concern. Marcus is brilliant, but he's not really interested in the business. Marcus can be difficult about commercial decisions. Marcus is, between us, a little unpredictable, you know how these genius types are. Never an attack. Always a worry. Shared in confidence. From a loyal partner and brother-in-law who only wanted what was best. Drop by drop, over years, Grant filled the people who controlled my company's governance with a portrait of me as the erratic, disengaged, difficult founder who needed to be managed, and filled my family with the same portrait at Sunday dinners. And I was in the lab the whole time, making the impossible, and I never felt the walls going up. That I can see the dinners now with the terrible clarity of hindsight, though I could not see them then. There was one, maybe 3 years before the end, that I have replayed 100 times. We were all at my parents' table, and I was tired because I'd been at the plant since dawn solving a production crisis that would have sunk a client's contract, and I was quiet because I am quiet when I'm tired, and I let the conversation go on around me. And Grant, warm, expansive, the center of the table as always, told a story about poor Marcus working himself to the bone. And then he said, laughing fondly, "Honestly, sometimes I don't know how the company survives him. He'll disappear into that lab for 3 days and forget we have investors, forget we have a board, forget there's a business to run. Thank God he's got people to handle the grown-up stuff, right?" And everyone laughed warmly, and my mother patted my hand, and I laughed too, because it was framed as affection, as a brother-in-law's fond teasing, and I did not understand that I had just been diminished in front of my own family one more careful degree, that Grant had just told my parents, in the guise of a joke, that I could not be trusted with grown-up things, that the company survived me rather than because of me. He did that 100 times over the years, always warm, always funny, always affectionate, and every single time a little more of my family's image of me was replaced with his version. The brilliant but hapless genius who needed handlers, and I sat there and laughed along and helped him do it, because I could not imagine, I genuinely could not imagine, that the man laughing fondly about me at my mother's table was building the case he would one day use to convince that same table that I was the villain. That is the thing about the drip. Each drop is nothing. You cannot object to a single one without looking paranoid and humorless. It is only when you add up 10 years of drops that you see it was never water. It was acid, and it had been dissolving you the whole time, one harmless joke at a time. Here is the thing I did that saved me, and I want to be honest that I did not do it because I was wise. I did it because I was careful in the one narrow way that careful chemists are careful, and because of that instinct at 2 in the morning that said keep the crown separate from the kingdom. The patent, the coding, the actual thing that Meridian existed to sell, never belonged to Meridian. It belonged to Reed IP Holdings, my separate company, and Meridian only had the right to use it through a license agreement between the two companies. And that license agreement, which I had written years before with a good lawyer during a quiet week when I'd gotten worried about exactly nothing in particular, contained a clause that Grant either never read carefully or never believed would matter. It was a key person clause. The license from Reed IP Holdings to Meridian was personal to me. If I ceased to be an officer and active participant in Meridian, for any reason, the license to use my coding would terminate automatically after a short cure period. In plain words, Meridian's legal right to manufacture the only product it sold depended entirely on me being there. Remove me, and within a matter of weeks the company would lose the right to make its own flagship product. Grant spent years maneuvering to seize a company. He never understood that the thing that made the company worth seizing would evaporate the moment he seized it, because it had never been the company's to begin with. It was mine. It had always been mine. And there was a second thing, a thing not even written down anywhere, a thing that lived only in my head, and I am going to tell you about it because it is the deepest card I held. The patent describes the coding, but a patent, by law, describes it does not fully enable, not for something this complex, and I had made sure quietly, deliberately over the years that the actual manufacturing process, the real one, the sequence of a few critical steps that made the difference between a coding that worked and a coding that failed inspection, was never fully documented anywhere. Not in the patent, not in the plant manuals, not in any file Grant or anyone else could seize. Those few steps lived in my head, and in the trained hands of exactly one other person, my senior chemist Priya Nair, who had been with me for 11 years and whom I trusted the way you trust the one person who has stood beside you through 10,000 failed batches. The written formula would get you 95% of the way. And in this coding, as in so many things, the last 5% was the whole thing. Grant could steal the company, the patent files, the plant, the equipment, the client list, all of it. And without me, and without Priya, he could not make a single gram of coding that would pass inspection. He would own a factory that could not make its only product. He just didn't know it yet. I did not know, in those years of quiet maneuvering, that I would ever need any of this. I want to be clear about that. I did not keep the license personal and the process in my head as a trap for Grant. I did it because I was a careful chemist who kept the crown separate from the kingdom, out of an instinct I couldn't have explained. But there is a lesson in that which I have come to believe with my whole heart, and I will give it to you now and again at the end. The quiet, careful, unglamorous habits you build when there is no crisis are the exact things that save you when the crisis comes. Grant built charm. I built structure. When the storm hit, charm blew away, and structure held. Remember that. The storm hit on a Tuesday, and it hit all at once, the way these things do when they have been prepared in the dark for years. It began with a phone call from Grant, warm as ever, asking if I could come in for a special board meeting on Tuesday morning. Something about the annual governance review. Nothing to worry about, just needed all the principals there. I thought nothing of it. I want you to sit with how completely I thought nothing of it, because it is the measure of how thoroughly I trusted the man. I walked into that Tuesday board meeting the way you walk into your own kitchen, and I sat down at the table I had sat at for 19 years, and I looked around at faces I thought I knew, and Grant stood up at the head of the table, my table, and he began to speak, and within about 90 seconds I understood that I had walked into an execution, and that I was the one being executed. Grant told the board, in a voice of deep and sorrowful reluctance, that it had become untenable to continue with the current leadership structure, that my well-documented disengagement from the business, my difficulty with commercial realities, my increasing unpredictability, had reached a point that threatened the company and its 400 employees and its shareholders. And then he said the thing that turned my blood to ice, because it was a thing I did not understand until he produced the paper. He said that he understood how hard this was, but that I had, in fact, already recognized this myself. And he slid a document across the table to me. And on that document, under a paragraph of dense legal language consenting to my own removal as an officer and transferring a critical block of my voting rights into a structure Grant controlled, was my signature. My signature, in my own hand as far as anyone in that room could tell. On a document I had never seen before in my life. I want to describe to you the specific horror of that moment, because it is a horror I would not wish on anyone and one that I think does not get talked about enough. It is one thing to be robbed. It is another thing entirely to be shown your own name in your own handwriting on the instrument of the robbery, and to understand, in a rush of vertigo, that the person who did this did not just take your company. He took your very hand, your signature, the small unique mark that is supposed to mean you and only you, and he used it against you, and everyone in the room is looking at it and looking at you and seeing not a victim but a man trying to weasel out of something he plainly signed. I stared at that signature. It was good. It was very, very good. And I said, in a voice that I could hear was too quiet, too shaky, exactly the voice of the unpredictable man Grant had spent years describing, I never signed this. This is forged. I have never seen this document. And I watched the faces around the table, and I watched them not believe me. I watched them exchange the small glances of people who had been prepared, for years, to see me as exactly the kind of man who would sign something and then deny it when it became inconvenient. Grant had built my disbelief into the room before I ever walked in. That is what years of drip, drip, drip had bought him. When the founder cried forgery, the room heard the ravings of the erratic genius they'd been warned about. I tried to fight it in that room, and the way I failed is a lesson in itself. I turned to the directors I thought were mine, the ones I'd known for years, and I appealed to them directly, and I watched each of them look away or look at Grant, and I understood, one face at a time, that Grant had gotten to every one of them before that meeting, that the special governance review had been rehearsed with each of them privately, that I was the only person in the room who was surprised. There was a woman on that board, Diane Halloran, whom I had personally recruited, whose seat I had championed, and I turned to her and I said, Diane, you know me. You know I wouldn't sign this and hide it. Look at the signature. Really look at it. And Diane Halloran, whom I had trusted, could not meet my eyes, and she said gently, in the voice you use on a sick man, Marcus, maybe you signed it and forgot. You've been under a lot of strain. No one thinks less of you. No one thinks less of you. As if the kindest interpretation of the evidence was that I was losing my mind, and that was the interpretation being offered to me as mercy. That was the moment I understood the true genius of what Grant had done. because he had constructed a situation in which there were only two available explanations for that document, and both of them destroyed me. Either I had signed it and was lying, which made me a fraud, or I had signed it and forgotten, which made me incompetent. The one explanation that was true, that someone had forged it, had been made literally unthinkable in that room preemptively by years of preparation. I sat there and felt the walls I'd never noticed finally close all the way, and I understood I was not going to win this in this room on this morning, and that the only thing left to decide was whether I would leave with my dignity or claw at the glass on the way out. I chose, though it cost me everything I had, to leave quietly. It was the hardest thing I have ever done, and it turned out to be the smartest, because a man who rages on his way out the door confirms the story, and a man who leaves quietly leaves the story unfinished, with room for a second act. I did not know that yet. I just knew, in my bones, that screaming would only prove them right. So I didn't scream. They voted. It was fast. My own equity, diluted and outmaneuvered over years I'd spent in the lab, was not enough to save me, especially not with the forged consent transferring my voting rights. And in the space of one Tuesday morning, I was removed as an officer of Meridian Coatings, the company I had built from a garage, invented the soul of, bled for on a cold floor at 2 in the morning. Grant, as the largest remaining principal and the man who had reluctantly stepped up to save the company from its unstable founder, took control. And they walked me out. They actually walked me out that same morning with Dennis from security, whose daughter's college I had helped pay for, escorting me to the door with his eyes on the floor, and Grant watching through the glass, mouthing that he was sorry. My keycard was deactivated before I reached my car. That is how fast it happens, when it has been prepared in the dark for years. 19 years to build. One Tuesday morning to lose. If you have listened this far, let me stop and ask you the question that lived in me during the worst of what came next, because I need to know how you would have answered it. When someone takes not just what you built but your good name, when they forge your very signature and use it to make the world believe you are the liar, is the thing you want back the company? Or is it the truth? Because for a while I confused the two and it nearly destroyed me, and I want to know, if it were your name on that forged page, whether you would fight first to get your money back or fight first to make them see who was really telling the truth. Tell me in the comments. It is not as simple a question as it sounds. I learned that the hard way. Stay with me, because the business betrayal, as devastating as it was not the thing that broke me. I could have survived losing the company. I am a builder. Builders can build again. What nearly broke me was what happened at my parents' house the following Sunday. When I went to my family, my blood, the people who had known me for 50 years, expecting comfort, expecting outrage on my behalf, expecting my sister to stand up and say that her husband was a liar. And instead I walked into a room that Grant had already reached. I remember the silence when I came in. My mother was in the kitchen and would not quite look at me. My father sat in his chair with his jaw set in a way I knew meant he had already decided something and did not want to discuss it. And Laura, my sister, my Laura, stood by the window with her arms crossed. And when she turned to me, her face was not the face of a sister whose brother has been wronged. It was the face of a woman who had been crying, and who had decided her tears were my fault. Grant was not there. He didn't need to be. He had been there all week, on the phone, at dinner, playing the wounded, reluctant hero who had been forced to do a terrible thing to save 400 jobs from my instability, and he had gotten to my family before I did, exactly as he'd gotten to the board, and I walked in carrying my truth like a gift and discovered that the room had already been sold a different story and had bought it. I tried to tell them. I said, Laura, he forged my signature. I never signed anything. This is a coup. He's been planning it for years. And I heard, even as I said it, how it sounded. I heard the voice of the erratic genius, the difficult founder, the man who signs things and then denies them, the exact man Grant had spent years describing to these very people. And my sister looked at me with a grief that I will carry to my grave, and she said, Marcus, do you hear yourself? Grant said you'd say this. He said you'd claim it was forged. He said your pride wouldn't let you admit you'd checked out for years, and the board finally did something about it. And I didn't believe him, Marcus. I defended you. Right up until you walked in here sounding exactly like he said you would. She was crying. I know you're hurting, but you cannot come into our parents' house and accuse my husband, the father of my children, of being a criminal, because you can't accept that you lost control of a company you stopped paying attention to. I won't let you do this to this family. I looked at my sister, the person who had understood me best my whole life, and I understood that Grant had done something to me far worse than steal my company. He had stolen my sister's belief in me. He had spent years quietly poisoning the well, and now, in the moment I needed her most, she looked at me and saw the villain he had painted, and there was nothing I could say, because every true word out of my mouth sounded exactly like the lie he'd predicted I would tell. That is the deepest evil of the smooth ones, the thing I most want you to understand. They don't just defeat you. They arrange it so that your truth becomes indistinguishable from the lie they've prepared, so that the more honestly you protest, the guiltier you look. I left my parents' house that Sunday with my mother not meeting my eyes and my father silent in his chair and my sister crying with her arms crossed. And I sat in my car in the driveway I'd learned to ride a bike in, and for the first time since I was a child, I did not know if I could survive something. My father was the one who cut deepest that day, and he did it without saying almost anything at all, which is how my father has always done his deepest cutting. My father is a man of few words and enormous, quiet pride, a retired machinist who worked with his hands his whole life, and the one thing that had ever passed between us that felt like his approval was the company, the thing I'd built, because building a real thing was the only language my father truly respected. When I was failing in that garage for 9 years, he never said he doubted me, but I felt it, and when I finally succeeded, when Meridian grew into something the whole town knew, my father never said he was proud, but I felt that too for the first time, and it had meant more to me than any amount of money. And now, in that living room, as I stood accused of ruining the very thing that had finally earned his quiet respect, my father looked at me, once a long look, and then he looked away and said nothing, and the nothing was the worst thing anyone said to me that day, because I understood what the silence meant. It meant he didn't know what to believe. It meant the son he'd finally been proud of had been recast, in his mind, as a man who'd thrown it all away and was now lying about it, and my father, who had no words for feelings even at the best of times, had no way to hold the possibility that I was telling the truth, and so he simply went silent and looked away, and let me stand there uncertain, for the first time in my adult life, whether my own father believed I was a liar. When, months later, the truth came out, when the forgery was proven and Grant's story collapsed, it was my father who surprised me most. He came to my new company, unannounced, an old man in the doorway of a leased industrial unit, and he walked the floor slowly, looking at the equipment, at the test panels, at the thing I'd built again from nothing, and at the end he stopped in front of me and he still didn't have the words, he never would, but he put his rough old machinist's hand flat on my chest, over my heart, and he held it there, and his eyes were wet, and he said the only sentence he could manage, which was, "You built it twice." And I understood that my father had just said, "I love you and I'm sorry, and I never should have doubted you, and I am prouder of you than I have ever been." All of it, in 3 words, in the only language he had. You built it twice. It is on a small plaque in my office now. My father died the following year. It was the last thing he ever said to me that mattered. And it was enough, it was more than enough, it was everything. I am going to be honest with you about the weeks that followed, because I think the honesty is more useful than the triumph. And because if you are in a low place right now, listening to this, I want you to know that the man who took everything back went through it first. I fell apart. There is no dignified way to say it. I had lost my company, my life's work, my invention, my income, my daily purpose, and worse than all of it, my family and my own name, because the version of me that now existed in the minds of everyone I loved was a liar and a failure and an unstable man who had ruined himself and blamed everyone else. I stopped sleeping. I stopped eating properly. I sat in my house, which I could no longer afford for long, and I let the darkness in, and there were nights, I will tell you plainly, there were nights I did not want to wake up, and if you have ever been in that particular dark, the dark of a person whose truth no one will believe, then you know it is a specific and terrible place, and I was in it, all the way in it, for the better part of a month. What pulled me out was a phone call, and I want to tell you who it was from, because it matters. It was from Priya Nair. Before I tell you about the call, I have to tell you about the person who kept me alive long enough to receive it, because I have not been fair to her in this story so far, and she deserves better. My wife, Elena. Elena and I have been married for 26 years. She knew me when I was a nobody at a paint company chasing an impossible idea in a garage, and she believed in the idea, and more than that, she believed in me, back when there was no evidence for either. During the dark month, the month after the family turned, when I stopped sleeping and stopped eating and let the worst of it in, Elena did not try to fix me because she is wiser than that. She simply refused to leave. She sat with me in the dark. She did not tell me it would be all right. because she is not a liar and we both knew it might not be. She did not tell me to snap out of it. She just stayed, a steady presence in the room while I came apart, and on the worst night, the night I told you about, the night I did not want to wake up, it was Elena who found me at the kitchen table at 3 in the morning and did not say a word, just pulled a chair beside me and put her hand on my back and stayed there until the sky went gray, and somewhere in that long silence I decided, without deciding, to keep going. I want to name her here because in every story like mine there is someone who does that, someone whose only role is to refuse to leave while you're in the dark, and they never get named, and they are, very often, the entire reason there is a rest of the story at all. Grant surrounded me with people who would leave the instant it stopped being convenient. Elena was the proof that I had also, without ever tracking it, built the other kind of relationship, the kind that stays. You find out which kind you have in the dark. I found out I had Elena, and it was because she kept me alive through that month that I was still there, still breathing, still capable of picking up the phone, when Priya called. Priya called me on a Thursday night, my senior chemist, the one other person on earth who knew the real process. Her voice was careful, because she was still inside the company and calling the ousted founder was not a safe thing to do, and she said, "Marcus, I need you to listen to me, and I need you to hear it as a chemist, not as a man who's grieving. Are you listening?" And I said I was. And Priya said, "They can't make it. Grant has them trying to run the Ardent Aerospace order without you, and the batches are failing. Every one. They don't understand why, because it's not in the documentation, because you and I both know it was never in the documentation. Marcus, the plant is producing coating that will not pass inspection, and Grant does not understand that it never will, not without you, not without the steps that live in your head and mine. He stole a factory that cannot make its own product. And I think when you're ready, you already know what that means." And I sat there in the dark with the phone against my ear, and something came back into me that had been gone for a month. Not hope exactly. Something colder and clearer and older than hope. The thing a careful chemist has when he realizes that the other man built his whole scheme on a fact that isn't true. Grant thought he'd won. Grant had seized a company whose only value was a thing he could not touch, could not make, and did not even understand he was missing. And I, sitting in my dark house, robbed of everything, was still the only man alive who held the actual keys. I stopped grieving that night and I started building, which is the only thing I have ever really known how to do. Let me tell you the order in which I did things, because the order is the whole lesson, and it is the same order every one of these stories should follow if you ever find yourself in one. I did not run to my family to gloat that the company was failing. I did not call the board. I did not confront Grant. I went quiet, the quietest I have ever been, and I built my case the way I build a coating, one verified layer at a time, and I made very sure of every single fact before I moved, because I understood that I would get exactly one chance to be believed after a month of being the boy who cried forgery, and if I moved too early with anything less than undeniable proof, I would simply confirm forever that I was the unstable liar Grant had made me. So I built, patiently, in the dark. And here is what I built. The first thing I needed was the truth about the signature, established by someone no one could dismiss as the ravings of a bitter founder. Through my attorney, a sharp and patient woman named Ellen Marsh, whom I had hired with nearly the last money I had, I obtained, through the proper legal channels, a copy of the forged consent document, the one with my signature on it. And Ellen brought in a forensic document examiner named Dr. Alan Pierce, a man who had spent 30 years testifying in courtrooms about exactly this, the authentication of signatures, and who did not care in the slightest about the drama of my situation and cared only about the evidence, which is exactly what I needed. I gave Dr. Pierce dozens of genuine samples of my signature, going back years, real ones, verified ones. And I gave him the forgery. And I want to tell you about the day he called me with his findings, because it was the first time in 2 months that another human being told me I was not crazy. Dr. Pierce said the signature on the consent document was a forgery, and not even a particularly sophisticated one to the trained eye, though it would fool any layperson, which is exactly why it had fooled a boardroom. He explained that a genuine signature is a ballistic act, a thing the hand does at speed, without thinking, with a characteristic rhythm and pressure and flow that is nearly impossible to truly replicate, and that a forgery, even a good one, is a drawing of a signature rather than a signing of one, and that under magnification the difference is stark. The forger's line shows hesitation, pen lifts, tremor, The tiny corrections of a hand that is copying rather than performing. My real signatures, he said, were written at speed by a hand that had made that mark 10,000 times. The one on the consent document was drawn, slowly, carefully, by someone tracing or copying, with all the telltale hesitations of a forgery. His conclusion, which he would state under oath in any court in the country, was unequivocal. I had not signed that document. Someone had forged my name. And when he said it, I put the phone down and I wept for the second time in the story. Not the despair of the garage floor turned inside out, but something like the first clean breath after nearly drowning, because for the first time since that Tuesday, the truth had a witness who was not me. I want to dwell on that feeling for a moment because I think it is the least understood part of being wrong this way, and if you have been through it, you will know exactly what I mean, and if you haven't, I want you to understand it so you can offer it to someone who has. The worst part of being robbed by a forgery was not the money and was not even the company. It was the specific insanity of knowing a truth that no one else would credit, of being the only person in your entire world who knew what had actually happened, and being told gently by everyone you loved that the thing you knew for a fact was instead a symptom of your unraveling. There is a particular madness that comes from that, from having your own certainty treated as evidence against you, and I had been living in that madness for 2 months, starting to wonder in my worst hours whether I actually was losing my mind, whether maybe I had signed it, whether maybe I was the thing they said I was. That is what Dr. Pierce gave me that could not be measured in dollars. He gave me back my own certainty. He was a stranger, an expert who cared nothing for me, examining lines under a microscope, and he said, in effect, you are not crazy, the thing you know is true, it happened exactly as you know it happened. And I want to tell anyone listening who is in that specific dark right now, being told that what you know is just your damage talking. Find your Dr. Pierce. Find the one witness, the one piece of evidence, the one person or fact outside your own head that can confirm the truth you're carrying, because being the sole keeper of an unbelieved truth will break you, and you do not have to carry it alone, and you are so often not nearly as crazy as they have worked to make you feel. But I did not run to my family with Dr. Pierce's report. This is the part where I most want you to learn from me because every instinct screamed at me to take that report straight to Laura and my parents and say, look, I told you I'm not crazy, he forged it, believe me now. And I did not do it, and thank God I did not, because I understood something about how belief works in families that had been sold a lie. A single report, waived by the accused, would not undo a year of Grant's careful poison. Laura would find a reason to doubt it, or Grant would smoothly explain it away, some expert I'd paid to say what I wanted. And I would once again be the desperate man grasping at anything, and I would burn my one piece of undeniable proof on a moment when they weren't ready to receive it. No, the truth, I understood, could not be argued into my family. It had to be made undeniable by events. I had to let Grant's own scheme collapse under the weight of the fact he didn't know was there, and I had to be standing, calm and vindicated, at exactly the moment the whole world could see it, so that my family would not have to take my word for anything, because the events themselves would say it louder than I ever could. So I put Dr. Pierce's report in a drawer, and I waited, and I built the rest. The rest was the license, and it was the beautiful, quiet, patient machine that Grant never saw coming. Remember the key person clause. Remember that the coding, the only thing Meridian made, belonged not to Meridian but to Reed IP Holdings, my separate company, licensed to Meridian only so long as I was an officer and active participant. Well, Grant had removed me as an officer. He had, with his own forged document, triggered the very clause that would destroy him. And after the short cure period specified in the agreement had passed with me very deliberately not curing anything, Ellen Marsh sent, on my behalf, a formal, precise, utterly polite legal notice to the board of Meridian Coatings, informing them that the license granted by Reed IP Holdings for the patented coating technology had terminated, in accordance with its terms, effective immediately, and that Meridian Coatings no longer possessed any legal right to manufacture, market, or sell any product incorporating the patented technology, and that continuing to do so would constitute willful patent infringement. In plain words, the letter told the company that Grant had seized that it no longer had the legal right to make the only thing it sold. The crown had left the kingdom. It had left the moment Grant pushed me out, exactly as I had structured it years before for reasons I couldn't have named. And now the kingdom was discovering it was empty. I would have given a great deal to see Grant's face when that letter reached the board. I am told later by Priya and by others who came back to me that it caused something close to panic. Because now Meridian faced two catastrophes at once, and they compounded each other. The company could not physically make passing product, because the process lived in my head and Priya's. And even the coating it was failing to make, it now had no legal right to make at all because the license had terminated. Grant had engineered a masterpiece of a takeover and won himself a factory that could neither legally nor practically produce its own flagship product. And he had done it by forging the signature of the one man who could have fixed either problem. The smooth man had outsmarted himself, because he had never understood the thing he was stealing. He thought Meridian's value was the company, the equity, the building, the brand. He never understood that Meridian's value was me, and had always been me, the chemistry in my head and the structure I'd built around it, and that you cannot forge a man's knowledge the way you can forge his name. And here is where the timing became everything, because Grant, it turned out, had a clock running that I did not fully know about until Priya told me, and it changed my patient plan into a race. Grant had been planning to sell. That was the real endgame, the thing the whole coup had been building toward. Grant did not want to run Meridian for 20 years the way I had. Grant wanted to cash out. He had been quietly negotiating to sell Meridian to a private equity firm called Coventry Partners, a large and lucrative deal that would have made Grant an extremely wealthy man and let him walk away from the company entirely, ideally before anyone understood what he'd broken. The coup had been timed to put him in control just long enough to close the sale. And the sale was close, weeks away, Priya thought, which meant I was now in a race I had not known I was running. If Grant closed the Coventry deal before the truth came out, he would escape with millions, and the mess, the failing product, the terminated license, the forged signature, would become someone else's problem to untangle years later in a courtroom, and Grant would be long gone with the money and the story that he'd successfully led the company right up until he sold it. I could not let the deal close. Everything now depended on making sure that when Coventry's lawyers looked closely, they found what Grant was hiding. If you have made it this far into my story, let me ask you the question I had to answer in that race, and I genuinely want to know how you would answer it because it is not obvious. I could have simply let Coventry buy the company, said nothing, and then, after the sale, enforced my terminated license against the deep-pocketed new owners and possibly made far more money from the wreckage than I ever would have otherwise. There was a version of this where staying silent made me rich. Or I could do the harder, poorer, more dangerous thing. Surface the truth now before the sale and blow up a deal worth millions in order to expose Grant and clear my name in front of my family, knowing it might cost me the fortune I could have extracted by staying quiet. Money or the truth? Which would you have chosen? Because I want to tell you, when it is real, when the money is that large and the family wound is that deep, it is a far harder choice than it sounds sitting here. Tell me in the comments what you would have done. I will tell you what I did. I chose the truth, and I chose it because of Laura. Because money had never been the wound. The wound was my sister's face at that window. Deciding her tears were my fault. The wound was my own name turned into a lie in the minds of everyone I loved. And no amount of money extracted quietly from Coventry 2 years later in a courtroom would ever undo that, because the family would never even know it had happened. The only thing that could clear my name was for the truth to detonate in the open. Now, in a way no one could argue with, in a way that made Grant's whole story collapse in front of the very people he'd sold it to. So I chose to blow up the deal. I chose the truth over the money. And I want to tell you, I have never once regretted it. Ellen Marsh made a single, careful, entirely proper move. She ensured that Coventry Partners' legal team, in the ordinary course of their due diligence, could not miss what they needed to find. There was nothing improper in it. A terminated license and a patent infringement notice are exactly the kind of material fact that a selling company is obligated to disclose and that a buyer's lawyers are paid to uncover. And all Ellen did was make certain the notice of termination was properly and formally on the record where any competent due diligence review would encounter it. And Coventry's lawyers were competent. When they discovered, in the middle of their due diligence, that the company they were about to buy did not actually possess the license to its own flagship product, that the license had terminated when the founder was removed, that the founder was alleging his removal was accomplished by forgery, and that the product could not even be manufactured to specification without that same founder, they did what any sane buyer does when it finds a corpse in the basement of the house it's about to purchase. They ran. The deal collapsed overnight, and Grant's escape hatch slammed shut with him still inside the burning building. And now, finally, with the deal dead and the license terminated and the product failing and the forensic report in my drawer, the truth was no longer something I had to argue. It was something that was happening visibly to everyone all at once, and I could simply stand in the light of it and let it speak. The collapse of Meridian under Grant was fast and total, and I watched it the way you watch a controlled demolition of a building you used to live in, with grief and with a terrible clarity. The Ardent Aerospace contract, the flagship order, failed. The coating the plant produced without me could not pass Ardent's inspections batch after batch, and Ardent, whose own reputation and whose own client's safety depended on that coating performing, did not have patience for a supplier that had suddenly, inexplicably, stopped being able to make the product it had reliably delivered for years. Ardent canceled the contract, invoked penalty clauses, and let it be known throughout the industry that Meridian could no longer deliver. And the industry, which is small, understood something was deeply wrong. Meridian's other clients began to flee because in the aerospace and defense world, a supplier who cannot deliver to spec is not a discount opportunity, it is a lethal risk. The company that Grant had seized, that had been worth a fortune 2 months before, that Coventry had nearly paid millions for, hollowed out in a matter of weeks, its value pouring out through the 2 holes Grant never saw. The license he didn't own and the knowledge he didn't have. Priya told me later what those weeks were like inside the plant, and it was worse than I'd imagined, and I take no pleasure in it, because the people who suffered most were not Grant. Grant sat in an office issuing increasingly frantic directives, but the coating does not care about directives. The plant ran batch after batch of my formula, following the written documentation exactly, and every batch came out wrong, subtly wrong, wrong in the way that only shows up in the inspection that matters, the salt fog test, the thermal cycling, the checks that stand between a coating and the aircraft it's supposed to protect. The chemists Grant had, good people, competent people, ran the process by the book and could not understand why the book was lying to them, because they did not know that the book had always been missing its final chapter, the few steps that lived only in my head and Priya's. And Grant, who did not understand chemistry and had never wanted to, could not grasp that this was not a problem money or pressure could solve, that you cannot bully a molecule into bonding, that there was no consultant he could hire and no employee he could threaten who could supply a process that existed nowhere but in the mind of the man he'd forged out the door. He brought in outside experts at enormous cost. They failed too, because the answer wasn't in any textbook. It was in 19 years of one man's specific obsession. The failed batches piled up. The waste mounted. The Ardent Aerospace deadline came and the plant had nothing that could pass. And I am told that was the day the real panic set in, the day Grant finally understood, too late, that he had stolen a machine and thrown away the only operator's manual, and burned the only 2 people who had it, and that no amount of the charm that had gotten him everything could conjure a passing batch of coating out of a plant that no longer had the man who'd invented it. That is the precise moment the story lost to reality. Reality does not negotiate. The coating passes inspection or it does not, and it did not, and no story Grant had ever told could change what came out of the oven. And then I moved on the forgery, and I did it in the one way that would clear my name completely, which was not to accuse Grant, but to let the evidence accuse him in front of the people who had believed him. Ellen Marsh filed suit. Not a loud, splashy, vengeful suit, but a precise one, alleging that my removal had been procured by a forged instrument, and attaching Dr. Alan Pierce's forensic report as evidence. And she did something more important than the filing itself. Because forgery of a legal instrument is not merely a civil wrong, it is a crime, she made sure that a full package of the evidence reached the appropriate authorities, so that the question of my forged signature would no longer be a family argument or a boardroom he said she said, but a matter examined by people whose entire job is to determine objectively whether a document was forged. And once that machinery began to turn, everything Grant had built on the assumption that no one would ever seriously investigate the signature began to come apart, because Grant had made one catastrophic error, the error the smooth ones so often make. He had never imagined that the erratic, disengaged, unstable chemist he'd spent years belittling would respond to being robbed not with the emotional flailing Grant had counted on, but with the cold, patient, evidentiary precision of a man who had spent his life proving things that were true and disproving things that were false. Grant had prepared for my emotions. He had not prepared for my method. The board of Meridian, the same board that had voted me out in 90 seconds, received Dr. Pierce's report and the news of the criminal referral, and I am told the atmosphere in those rooms changed with the speed of a chemical reaction reaching its threshold. Because a board of directors will tolerate a great many things, but the one thing it cannot tolerate, the thing that terrifies every director personally, is having voted, on the record, to remove a founder on the basis of a document that turns out to have been forged, while that founder's company collapses around them and the authorities begin asking questions about the forgery. Directors have their own names, their own reputations, their own legal exposure. And one by one, the people who had been so sure of Grant's version began, quietly, to distance themselves from him, to remember that they'd had reservations, to cooperate with the inquiry, to discover that their loyalty to the smooth man had never been loyalty at all, only convenience, and convenience evaporates the instant it becomes dangerous. Grant, who had spent 15 years accumulating allies through charm, learned the thing that all the Grants eventually learn: that allies bought with charm are not allies at all, and that they will leave you at exactly the speed with which the truth arrives. But the board and the courts were never the reckoning that mattered to me. The reckoning that mattered happened in my parents' living room, and it happened because of my sister. Laura came to me. That is the part one did not expect, the part one had stopped letting myself hope for. She did not wait for a court to rule or for me to prove anything to her. She came to me before all of that resolved, and I have come to understand why, and it breaks my heart in a different way every time I think about it. Because Laura had begun, slowly, to see Grant clearly from the inside, in the small ways that a wife sees a husband when the mask slips at home. As Meridian collapsed, Grant's charm curdled, the way it does when there is no longer anything to be gained by it, and Laura began to see the coldness underneath, the panic, the way he spoke about the failing company, the way he spoke when he thought she wasn't really listening, about people as instruments. And she began to remember things. The way he'd talked about my company, before they were even married, with a hunger she'd mistaken for admiration. The years of small comments about me, the careful, affectionate poison, that she now recognized for what it had been. And when she heard, through the family, that a forensic examiner had found my signature was forged, she did not, as Grant surely expected, rush to his defense. She went very still, my sister, the way I go still, because we are more alike than either of us ever admitted, and she began, at last, to do the arithmetic, and the arithmetic came up her husband. She came to my house on a gray afternoon, and she stood on my porch, and when I opened the door she was already crying, and she said, "Marcus, I need you to tell me the truth, and I need you to tell it to me as my brother, and I promise I will believe you this time, I promise, just please tell me the truth. Did he forge your name?" And I looked at my sister, and I did not gloat, and I did not make her grovel for the month I'd spent in the dark because she'd believed him over me, because she was already carrying enough, and because that is not who I want to be. I just said quietly, "Yes, Laura, he forged my name, and I've spent this whole time proving it the right way, so that you would never have to just take my word for it, so that you could see it for yourself." And my sister came apart on my porch, and I held her, and she said the thing that was the real victory of this entire story: worth more than the company, worth more than the money, worth more than seeing Grant ruined. She said, "I'm so sorry, Marcus. I should have known. You're my brother. I've known you my whole life. I should have known you don't lie, and I let him make me forget it. Can you ever forgive me?" And I told her the truth, which was that there was nothing to forgive because she had not betrayed me. She had been deceived by a professional, the same as the board, the same as our parents, the same as everyone, and being deceived by a master is not a sin, it is only a wound, and the only person who owed anyone an apology was the man who had spent years engineering all of our blindness. We stood on my porch and cried, my sister and I, and in that moment I had already won, whatever the courts later said, because the thing Grant had actually stolen from me, the thing I had actually fought to get back, was not the company. It was this. It was my sister knowing who I am. And here is the twist that I did not see coming. The thing that turned Laura's private reckoning into her freedom. As the investigation into Grant deepened, as the forensic evidence and the financial records were examined, it emerged that the forgery of my signature had not been Grant's only forgery, nor his only deception. Grant had been hiding assets from Laura too, quietly, for years, structuring things in the marriage the way he structured everything, as a man who saw the people closest to him as instruments and exits. The Coventry sale, it turned out, had been intended to fund not just Grant's wealth but Grant's departure. There was another life he'd been quietly preparing to step into once he'd cashed out, and my sister and their children were not part of it. Grant had married Laura as a ladder, exactly as I had come to suspect, a ladder into my company and my family, and once he'd climbed it and grabbed what he was reaching for, he'd intended to kick it away. My sister discovered, in the wreckage of Grant's scheme, that the man she'd defended against her own brother had never truly loved her at all, had used their marriage as a tool from the very beginning, the same way he'd used my signature, the same way he used everything. It was a terrible thing to learn. And it was also, I watched it happen, the thing that finally and fully freed her, because you cannot grieve the loss of something that was never real. You can only eventually be grateful to have discovered the truth in time to save the rest of your life. Grant's fall was as complete as his rise had been smooth, and it happened without my ever having to lift a hand against him directly, because I had learned the deepest lesson of all these situations. You do not need to destroy a man who has built his entire life on a lie. You only need to remove the lie and let the structure fall on its own. Meridian, the company Grant had killed, was worthless by the time the dust settled. A hollowed-out shell with no license, no product, no clients, and a founder forgery scandal attached to its name. The fortune Grant had schemed for evaporated. There was nothing left to sell, no golden exit, only the ruin of the thing he'd stolen. The criminal matter of the forgery moved forward with the weight of Dr. Pierce's unassailable evidence, and Grant, who had counted on never being seriously investigated, found himself facing consequences that charm could not talk its way out of. Because the law, unlike a boardroom or a family dinner, does not care how likable you are, it cares what the evidence shows, and the evidence showed a forged signature in Grant's hand on the instrument of his own enrichment. He lost the company he'd killed, he lost the fortune he'd schemed for, he lost my sister and his access to my family, and he lost, most of all, the one thing a man like Grant values above everything, which is the good opinion of the room, because there is no charming your way back into a room that has seen, in black and white, exactly what you are. The smooth man ended up with nothing, and he ended up with nothing because he had never understood that he'd built his whole life on borrowed belief, and belief, unlike a signature, cannot be forged, can only be earned, and Grant had never earned a thing. Grant came to see me once, near the end of it, after the deal had collapsed and the company was a corpse and the investigation was closing around him, and I want to tell you about it because it was the only time in this whole story that I stood face to face with the man who had taken everything, and it taught me the last thing I needed to know about people like him. He showed up at my door on a weeknight, unannounced, and the man on my porch was not the Grant I had known for 15 years. The suit was still expensive, but he wore it like it no longer fit, and the charm, the terrible effortless charm, was gone, or rather it was still there, but I could see the machinery of it now, see him reaching for it and finding it wouldn't start, the way an engine won't turn over in the cold. And he stood on my porch, the same porch where my sister had wept and come home to me, and he tried, one last time, to manage what I believed. He started with an apology that was not an apology, the kind that explains why the thing was really justified. He'd been under pressure. The board had wanted change. He'd only done what anyone in his position would have done. And when he saw that the practiced remorse wasn't landing, he shifted smoothly to the offer, because men like Grant always have an offer, and he said that perhaps he and I could find a way to work together again, that I clearly held the cards now, that there was still value to be salvaged, that we were, after all, family. Family. He said the word family to me on my porch, the man who had forged my name and used my sister as a ladder and turned my parents against me. And I looked at Grant and I felt, to my own surprise, no rage at all. What I felt was the quiet a chemist feels when a long experiment finally resolves, and the answer, after all the noise, is simple. I said, Grant, I'm not going to work with you, and there's nothing to negotiate, and you should go. But I'll tell you the one thing I actually want you to understand, not because it will help you, but because I think you've genuinely never known it, and someone should tell you once before the end. You spent 15 years thinking you were the smart one and I was the fool. You watched me disappear into the lab and you thought I was hiding from the real game, the game of people and power and belief, the game you were so good at. But I wasn't hiding, Grant. I was building the only thing that turned out to be real. You played the story and you were a master of it, and the story beat me for about 2 months. And then reality had its vote. That's the whole thing you never understood. There's a world made of what people believe, and you were a king in it, and there's a world made of what's actually true, of whether the coding passes inspection at 30,000 feet. And in that world you were nothing, you were always nothing, because you never made a single real thing in your life. You forged my name because it was the closest you could get to being able to do what I can do. But you can't forge the thing, Grant. You can only forge the name of the man who makes it. Go home. There's nothing here for you. There never was. And Grant looked at me. And for just a moment the machinery stopped entirely, and something almost human and almost frightened looked out at me. A man realizing, far too late, the exact shape of what he'd never had. And then he turned and walked back to his car, and I closed my door, and that was the last time I ever spoke to my former partner, my former brother, the smooth man who forged my name. And I, the erratic, unstable, disengaged founder they'd walked out of his own building on a Tuesday morning, rebuilt. I did not try to save Meridian. This surprised some people, who assumed that vindication meant crawling back to reclaim the throne of the company that had cast me out. But Meridian, by then, was a poison shell, its name attached to a scandal and a collapse, and I am a builder, not a scavenger, and I did not want the corpse. I wanted the thing that had always been mine, and the thing that had always been mine was the coding, the patent, the knowledge, the crown I had so carefully kept separate from the kingdom. So I took it because it had always been mine to take, and I started again. A new company, my own, clean, built the right way this time, with the equity structured so that no smooth man could ever again quietly outmaneuver me over years I spent in the lab. And here is the thing that told me everything about what actually creates value in this world. The clients followed me. Ardent Aerospace, which had fled Meridian when it could no longer make the coding, came to my new company because they had never actually needed Meridian at all. They had needed the coding, and the coding was me. The customers, the real ones, understood what Grant never had, that the value had never lived in the building or the brand or the equity. It had lived in the mind of the quiet chemist they'd walked out the door, and they followed that mind to wherever it went next. Within a year, my new company was doing what Meridian had done, better, cleaner, and Meridian's empty building stood as a monument to a man who had stolen a kingdom and never understood that the crown had walked out the front door on a cold Tuesday morning, mouthed at through the glass by the very man who owned it. I want to tell you about the first passing batch at the new company because it closed a circle that had opened on a garage floor 20 years before, and it is the moment I think of when I think of how this really ended. We had almost nothing at first: a leased industrial unit, second-hand equipment, a skeleton crew of the loyal, and a mountain of doubt from an industry that had watched Meridian implode and wasn't sure what had really happened. And on the day we ran our first full production batch of the coding in the new place, Priya and I stood over the test panels ourselves, the two of us, the way we had 1,000 times, and we ran the salt fog test and the thermal cycling, the same inspections that had defeated Grant's plant batch after batch, and we watched, and the coding held. Perfect. Flawless. The impossible thing made real again by the two pairs of hands that were the only ones on earth that could make it. And Priya, who is not a sentimental woman, looked at those test panels and then looked at me, and neither of us said anything for a moment, because there was nothing to say that the panels weren't already saying. 20 years earlier, I had wept alone on a cold garage floor because I had made something that existed nowhere else in the world. And here it was again, the same thing, made in a leased unit with second-hand equipment by a man they'd walked out of his own building. And it worked because the thing had never been the building or the brand or the company. The thing had always been the knowledge, and the knowledge had walked out the door with me and could not be forged, could not be stolen, could not be seized by any smooth man with a trace signature. When Ardent Aerospace's engineers came to qualify our line, months later, one of them, an old contact who'd known me for years, shook my hand and said quietly, "We always knew it was you, Marcus. We just couldn't say so while the lawyers sorted it out. The coding was always you. The coding was always you." I have thought about those 5 words more than almost any others in this story. They are the whole truth of it. Grant took everything that could be taken. He could not take the thing that was actually me. Priya came with me, of course, my senior chemist, the one who'd made the phone call that pulled me out of the dark, and she is my partner now, a real one, with real equity and my complete trust, because she earned it across 11 years and 10,000 batches, which is the only way trust is ever really earned. Many of the good people from Meridian came too, the ones who had watched me get walked out and had said nothing because they were afraid for their jobs and had carried the shame of that silence. And I did not hold their silence against them because not everyone is in a position to fall on a sword, and I would rather build a company full of people who learned something than nurse a grudge against people who were simply afraid. And Dennis from security, the man who could not meet my eyes at the glass door, the man whose daughter's college I had helped pay for, Dennis found me months later and he could barely get the words out, and I stopped him before he could finish apologizing, and I hired him on the spot because Dennis had been placed in an impossible position by a liar and had done what a frightened man does, and I understood that, and life is too short and too precious to spend it punishing people for not being heroes in the one moment you needed them to be. He runs security for my new company now. He has never once let me down since, and I never expected him to, because the fault was never his. My name is Marcus Reed. I want to tell you what I learned, and it is the only thing I have to give you at the end of all this. And it is the thing I most wish someone had told me before a smooth man walked me out of my own life on a Tuesday morning. The world runs on two kinds of people, and it is important, it may someday be the most important thing you ever understand, to know which kind you are dealing with. There are people who build things, and there are people who position themselves next to the things other people build. The builders make the coding, write the code, grow the crop, do the surgery, teach the child, make the actual thing that has actual value. And the positioners, the smooth ones, produce nothing, but they are masters of the one skill the builders neglect, the skill of managing what other people believe. And because builders are busy building, and tend to assume that the value they create will speak for itself and protect itself, they are, again and again, robbed by the positioners who understand a secret the builders refuse to learn. That in the short run, the story of a thing can defeat the truth of a thing, and a man who controls the story can take what a man who controls the truth has made. Grant controlled the story for years. He controlled how the board saw me, how my family saw me, how I was walked out my own door. For a while, the story beat the truth completely. But here is the second half of what I learned, and it is the half that should give you hope if you are a builder who has been robbed by a positioner, because I have been exactly that, and I am telling you from the far side of it. The story can beat the truth in the short run, but it cannot make the coding, cannot do the surgery. It cannot grow the crop or write the code or make the actual thing. In the end, reality has a vote, and reality's vote is final. And when the moment comes that the thing actually has to work, has to pass inspection, has to be real, all the story in the world cannot save the man who only ever managed belief. Grant could forge my signature. He could not forge my knowledge. He could steal my company. He could not steal the thing that made the company worth stealing, because that thing lived in my mind and my hands and the careful structure I'd built around them, and knowledge and character are the two things in this world that genuinely cannot be forged. So if you are a builder, hear me, keep building, because it is the building that is real, but do not be naive the way I was naive. Keep the crown separate from the kingdom. Build structure, not just things. Do not assume the value you create will protect itself, because there is a smooth man somewhere who is studying how to take it, and he is counting on your assumption that talent is its own armor. It is not. Talent makes the thing. Structure keeps it. You need both. And if they have already taken it from you, if a smooth man has already walked you out of your own life and turned the people you love against you and left you sitting in the dark unable to make anyone believe the truth, then hear this last thing from someone who was exactly there, all the way in that dark, closer to not coming back than I have told even my sister. Do not flail. Do not beg the people who've been poisoned to believe you, because your desperation is exactly the confirmation the liar predicted. Go quiet. Go still. Become the careful, patient, evidentiary version of yourself, and build your truth the way you'd build anything real, one verified layer at a time, and do not move until it is undeniable, and then do not argue it, but arrange things so that reality itself says it for you, louder than you ever could. The truth is the one ally that never leaves, because unlike the smooth man's borrowed friends, the truth does not care whether it is convenient. It only waits to be proven, and it is patient, and it is certain, and it will outlast every story ever told about you, if you have the discipline to let it. So let me leave you with the question I have carried since that Tuesday, and let me ask it plainly. If a man you trusted, a partner, a brother, forged your very name, took your life's work, and turned your own family against you so completely that your truth sounded like a lie, what would you fight for first, the money or the truth? Would you take the quiet fortune? Or would you blow it all up to make them see who you really are? I chose the truth over the money, and I would choose it again 1,000 times, because the money was never the wound and the money was never the cure. But I know that is not an easy choice, and I want to know yours. Tell me in the comments. And tell me, too, if a smooth man has ever walked you out of something you built, because I promise you that someone listening to this right now is sitting in that exact dark, being told they are the crazy one, and they need to hear from you that the truth is patient, and that the thing they built with their own hands can never really be forged, and that it is not over. It is never over while you are still the only one who knows how to make the thing. Grant walked me out my own front door and mouthed that he was sorry through the glass. He was not sorry, but he was, without knowing it, exactly right about one thing, because he really had every reason to be sorry. He just didn't know yet how sorry he was going to be. I built something no one else in the world could make. They can forge your name. They can take your building. They cannot take the thing that is actually you. Go build it again. And this time, keep the crown separate from the kingdom.